Right. So get this. We're diving into this future where like countries maybe aren't the big players anymore.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like picture a world of startup nations.
Oh,
These like mini countries built for just going fast and like pulling in investors like crazy.
yeah.
We're going to break down excerpts from Capitalism Without Democracy, The Rise of Startup Nations.
Right.
And oh boy, it's a wild ride.
It's interesting how the book argues that this isn't just some like sci-fi thing. It's saying democratic capitalism, like the one we know,
Yeah.
might be on its way out, and these startup nations could be like the next big thing.
Hold on.
Yeah.
What exactly is a startup nation like, according to this Win Slobodan guy?
He pictures them as these like super efficient hubs with barely any regulations and taxes, like magnets for investment and new ideas. Think of them as like economic pressure cookers
Okay.
where businesses can boom with less government, like, butting in.
So less red tape, more profit.
Yeah.
I bet some people are like, yeah, I'm into that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The book even points to examples like Giorgia Meloni in Italy,
Right.
who's pushing for these special economic zones, trying to revive their economy.
Interesting.
And there are whispers of similar ideas kind of popping up in the U.S. too.
But wouldn't that just make the rich richer?
Yeah.
Isn't that like a recipe for just huge inequality?
That's one of the big questions the book brings up.
Yeah.
It argues that startup nations could really speed up that wealth gap, with
Yeah.
investors having way too much power.
Okay, but haven't we always had powerful investors throughout history?
Yeah.
What makes these startup nations so different?
Think about it.
Okay.
If these mini countries are like specifically made for investors,
Right.
wouldn't those investors basically be the ones in charge?
Right.
The book suggests they could have a ton of influence over how these nations are run, maybe even at the cost of like democratic processes.
Okay, so less democracy, more investor control.
Yeah.
That's a pretty wild idea, even for like a Peter Thiel type, right? He's all about this startup nation vision, isn't he?
Thiel is definitely a key player in all this.
Yeah.
The book gets into his philosophy,
Okay.
especially this thing called mimetic desire.
Okay.
Basically, we copy what we see other people wanting.
Right.
Think about all the hype around Elon Musk.
Yeah.
People want that success.
Totally.
And they might be willing to accept some pretty weird systems to get it.
So like chasing that Musk level success could make people blind to the problems of this system.
Yeah.
That's kind of scary.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder if people are willing to give up some freedoms for a shot at the big time, is that really free will?
Wow.
The book calls this consensual slavery and uses Dubai as an example.
Dubai. Isn't that place like a playground for rich people?
Yeah.
How does that fit into this?
Well, Dubai has had crazy economic growth.
Right.
But it's not exactly known for its democracy.
Yeah.
The book suggests it's a peek into what a startup nation future could look like. A system where economic success might come at the cost of individual freedom.
So trading freedom for money.
Yeah.
That's a trade-off that really makes you think.
And the book doesn't shy away from how complicated it is.
Right.
It explores how this model could create a system where certain groups, like migrant workers, might face exploitation all for the sake of progress.
That's a little dark. But before we get too dystopian, let's talk about the PayPal mafia.
Okay.
This book mentions Thiel's connection to them, right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It argues that this group, including Thiel, Musk, and others,
Right.
they have a lot of power in the tech world and how we think about the future. And Thiel's experiences, especially his time in Namibia and South Africa, seem to have really shaped his worldview.
Namibia and South Africa? That's a long way from Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
What happened there that might have influenced his thinking about these startup nations?
Well, the book suggests that his early experiences in those countries, especially with like the strict order and hierarchy he saw in some places, it might have made him believe in the need for a strong leader in like societal progress.
So he's seen how things work under tighter control.
Yeah.
But how does that experience translate to his vision for these startup nations? What parts of those societies really stick with him?
Think about it.
Yeah.
He talks about going to a school in Namibia where uniforms were mandatory and there was a big focus on discipline.
Right.
He seemed to see this structure not as like oppressive, but as like building a sense of purpose.
Okay.
It's possible he sees a similar potential in the controlled environment of a startup nation to push progress and innovation.
So he's not just looking at economic models.
Right.
He's pulling from his personal experience with different ways of governing.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
And that's what makes this so fascinating. This isn't just like an economic theory.
Right.
It's a worldview shaped by personal experiences, philosophical ideas, and a desire to change the world in a very specific way.
Okay, so we've got this potential shift from democratic capitalism to a world of startup nations driven by investors and maybe influenced by experiences from totally different cultures.
Yeah.
Where do we even go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it? The book lays out this whole vision of the future where traditional nation states might not be as important anymore.
Yeah.
And these smaller startup nations could become the main players.
Right.
Always fighting for investment and the best talent.
It's like a Wild West of economics. You know, everyone's trying to grab a piece.
Right.
But if we're talking about a world reshaped by these startup nations, what would it actually be like for regular people?
Well, the book presents like a best case, worst case scenario.
Okay.
In the ideal version, imagine cities that are just like buzzing with innovation, new tech popping up everywhere, everything's streamlined, like from government services to everyday life. It's a world where, like, if you work hard and have that entrepreneurial spirit, you can actually get ahead.
It sounds like a dream for the go-getters, but let's be real.
Yeah.
There are always downsides.
Yeah.
What's the potential dark side to all this?
One of the biggest worries is that wealth inequality could go through the roof. If these startup nations are basically like playgrounds for the super rich, the people who control all the money, the power dynamics could get really messed up.
So it's not just about getting investment. It's about who controls it.
Exactly. And the book argues that those who aren't part of that like elite investor class, they could end up left behind, facing limited social safety nets and fewer chances to climb the economic ladder.
You mentioned Dubai earlier.
Yeah.
Does the book give any real-world examples of how this consensual slavery thing could actually happen?
It points to the situation with migrant workers in Dubai.
Oh, okay.
A lot of them face really tough working conditions, limited rights, and they often depend completely on their employers. The book suggests that this kind of dynamic could become more common in a startup nation model, where the drive for economic growth might be more important than like individual rights.
That's a pretty grim outlook.
Yeah.
So you're saying people might actually choose to be exploited just for a shot at making it?
That's the messed up part, isn't it? The book argues that this mimetic desire we talked about, it could push people to accept unfair conditions, believing that if they just work hard enough, they can also join the elite.
Like a twisted American dream.
Exactly. And it raises a lot of ethical questions. If this startup nation model really takes over, what happens to those who don't make it to the top? What protections will there be for the vulnerable?
It's starting to feel like gambling with people's lives.
And it's not just about economics. The book argues this shift could also erode, like, democratic values. Thiel, for example. He seems pretty skeptical of traditional democratic processes.
So he's not just pushing for a change in economic models. He's questioning the very foundation of how we govern ourselves.
He seems to believe that democracy can be inefficient, prone to stagnation, and too focused on short-term gains. He argues that a more centralized approach, where those with money and vision are the ones making decisions, might be better for driving progress.
But wouldn't that put all the power in the hands of a very small group? Isn't that dangerous?
That's the core of the debate, isn't it? Who gets to decide what progress even means? And what happens to dissenting voices in a system where investors have so much control?
This is all getting a bit heavy. Let's go back to something we talked about earlier. Peter Thiel's experiences in Namibia and South Africa. The book seems to suggest those experiences shaped his views, right?
Absolutely. The book explores how those environments, with their focus on order and hierarchy,
might have contributed to his belief that a strong guiding hand, especially from those with money, is necessary for, like, societal advancement.
So he's not just making these ideas up. They're based on his own experiences with different systems of government.
And that's what makes this whole conversation so interesting. It's not just theoretical models. It's about how personal experiences, philosophical beliefs, and even cultural influences can shape how we imagine the future.
But is there any proof these ideas are catching on? Are we really about to see these startup nations popping up all over the place?
The book argues that we're already seeing the early signs, the rise of figures like Giorgia Meloni, who are pushing for these special economic zones. Suggests there's a growing desire for this kind of model. And with the PayPal mafia having so much influence, especially in tech, the potential for these ideas to spread and take hold is definitely there. Okay, so maybe this isn't just a fantasy. We could actually see these startup nations becoming real.
And that's why it's so important to have these conversations now. Before things go too far. We need to think critically about the trade-offs, the risks and benefits, and what kind of future we want to build.
So if we zoom out and look at the big picture, what are the key takeaways from this book? What do we want our listeners to really think about?
I think the main message is that we're at a crossroads. The old model of democratic capitalism might be fading. And something new is coming. Whether that's good or bad, well, that's for each of us to decide.
But we can't just ignore it and pretend it's not happening. We have to engage with these ideas, even if they make us uncomfortable.
Exactly. We need to be aware of the potential consequences, both good and bad, and ask ourselves some tough questions.
Like what?
Are we willing to trade some of our freedoms for economic prosperity?
Is a world ruled by startup nations something we really want?
These are some pretty heavy questions. And I have to admit, this whole consensual slavery thing is really sticking with me. It's hard to imagine people choosing to be exploited. But then again, we've seen it happen throughout history.
That's the dark side of human ambition, isn't it? The desire for success, for a better life. It can sometimes blind us to the compromises we're making along the way.
So where do we go from here? What's the next step in this conversation?
I think the most important thing is to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep the conversation going. This book brings up a lot of challenging ideas. But it also gives us a glimpse into what the future might hold. And in the end, the future is shaped by the choices we make today.
So before we wrap up this deep dive, there's one more thing I'm curious about. The book mentions that Peter Thiel has a specific term for these mini nations he's envisioning.
He calls them optimized territories. Catchy, right? But it really makes you think about, like, what it all means. Are we talking about optimizing for profit, for innovation, or like something else entirely?
That's the key point, isn't it? The book talks about how this whole idea of optimization can be kind of misleading. It sounds good, like who doesn't want things to be optimized? But optimized for who and at what cost?
So it's not just about making things efficient. It's about who gets to decide what optimal even is.
Exactly. And the book suggests that in a world full of these optimized territories, people with the money, the investors, they would have a huge say in those definitions. It makes you wonder if this model would really help everyone or just the small group of people.
We've talked a lot about the downsides, the risks of inequality, exploitation, and losing democratic values. But could anything good come out of this model?
The book does say there might be some benefits. For example, it suggests that these optimized territories could become like hubs for innovation. Free from the bureaucracy and regulations that slow things down in regular countries.
So less red tape, more breakthroughs. That's pretty appealing.
It is. And the book argues that this competition between optimized territories, it could actually lead to good advancements in things like technology, medicine, even government. It's like a global race to the top, with each territory trying to be better than the others to attract the best people and investments.
But wouldn't that create a situation where it's like winner takes all? What about those who can't keep up?
That's the flip side. The book doesn't hide the fact that this model could create a big gap between the rich and the poor. And it asks questions about what kind of safety nets or support systems would be there for those who are left behind.
This is a lot to think about. This whole conversation has been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
I'm seeing the world in a whole new way.
That's the power of thinking about challenging ideas, isn't it?
It is.
It pushes us to get out of our comfort zones.
Yeah.
And face some uncomfortable truths about the world.
So if we were to leave our listeners with just one final thought, what would it be?
I think the most important thing to remember is this.
Okay.
The future isn't decided yet.
Mm.
The choices we make today, the ideas we believe in, the systems we support,
Yeah.
they will shape the world we live in tomorrow.
It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in creating the future.
Exactly. And whether we're talking about optimized territories, startup nations, or any other model,
Right.
the key is to stay informed, to have these conversations,
Yeah.
and to think about the long-term consequences of our choices.
Well said. That's a perfect way to wrap things up.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the future of capitalism and democracy.
Yeah, it's been fun.
It's been a wild ride, and we hope it's given you some things to think about, too. Until next time, keep those brains buzzing.